Hi, everybody. This recording, I hope, is going to help you understand some of the behavioral therapies that are addressed in your textbook. I'm hoping that I can maybe build upon that by offering some other examples or descriptions. But okay, just like all of our other psychotherapy approaches, our behavioral techniques, we're going to want to know some core names associated with them, their assumptions and goals, specific strategies, and some maybe strengths and limitations of them. So first up, the big name that we associate with the behavioral therapies is that of Mary Kover Jones. It's worth noting, while a lot of our other psychotherapies have kind of founding fathers, here we have a legitimate founding mother. Mary Kover Jones actually, I think, is a good example to bring up in contrast to John Watson. If you remember, John Watson was the guy who conditioned little Albert to exhibit a fear response to a white laboratory rat, which most people recognize seems kind of mean, and by modern standards might be considered kind of unethical. Well, Mary Kover Jones actually thought about, hey, well, maybe can't we use these same learning strategies like classical conditioning? If those can be used to introduce fears, maybe we can use them to help people overcome fears. So she actually had a very famous case study subject, just like Watson had little Albert. Her famous case study subject was a child known in the research literature as Little Peter, who, somewhat ironically maybe, was afraid of white rabbits. So Mary Kover Jones figured out that we could use something now known as counter conditioning to help him develop a more positive response to the thing that he feared. So she placed him in a room where he had kind of a tasty snack, one of his favorite treats, and then introduced the bunny or a rabbit to that setting. And gradually, as he had more exposures to eating his treats, which brought positive feelings and reactions next to this rabbit, he developed a positive reaction to the rabbit. So no longer afraid. Completely the opposite of what Watson was doing to little Albert. So the goal of this approach to psychotherapy, as you might guess, is to employ behaviorist learning techniques in order to help people adopt more helpful behaviors. One thing to be aware of is this is really not an insight-based psychotherapy. Pure behavioral therapists actually wouldn't concern themselves at all with whether or not people ever figured out what caused their phobia. As long as they could eliminate the avoidance behaviors that accompany the phobia and maybe the anxiety responses that are behaviors associated with like panic reactions in phobias, then mission accomplished. And to be fair, a lot of behavioral therapists, I mean, they're not coldly calculating, unconcerned about how their clients think or feel, but it's actually presumed to be not as important to help them change their thinking. What we're trying to change is behavior if you're practicing pure behavioral therapy. So we've got a lot of tricks in the toolkit if we're talking behavior therapies. For one, counter conditioning is kind of the umbrella term that's used to describe use of classical conditioning techniques to get someone to have a new and more desirable reaction to a stimulus that they already have a reaction to. In the case of exposure therapies, all the exposure therapies, like the name suggests, involves exposing people to things that they might find typically anxiety producing, and then trying to swap out the anxiety response to that stimulus for something that's more helpful and maybe even in direct opposition to an anxiety response, like a relaxation response. So, for example, if you do this process gradually, we call it systematic desensitization. So folks with phobias might start out by making a list of all the things connected to, if it's a snake phobia, maybe they make a list of all the things connected to and about snakes that they find aversive or unpleasant. And then they'd sit down with their therapist and rank them in order from least anxiety-provoking to most anxiety-provoking, and then gradually work through the list. As they do so, as they're exposed to the stimuli that cause fear. So maybe the lowest thing on the list for someone with a snake phobia would be like looking at crude drawings of snakes in a cartoon book. So if even that is a little anxiety-provoking for them, you might teach them relaxation techniques like deep breathing and muscle relaxation, and together look at these crude drawings of snakes in the cartoon book until they feel completely comfortable in the presence of those cartoon and crudely drawn snakes. Once they feel comfortable at that level, you might work up to item number 2 on the list, which might be only slightly more anxiety-provoking than the drawings of the snakes, At the very top of the anxiety hierarchy might be like full confrontation of a snake in real life that you would have to like touch or maybe hold in your hand. By the time you reach that point, the person's already worked through a lot of like lower levels of this and have a strong repertoire in calming themselves, so they might actually be able to overcome and cope with this stimulus when presented at high intensity. So that's a very gradual way of doing exposure. The opposite to that would be flooding. So having the person confront the stimulus at full intensity while simultaneously teaching relaxation strategies and helping them do deep breathing to kind of counter any panic symptoms that they might experience. The idea why you would use flooding is because maybe some types of conditions, phobic responses or anxiety responses, don't have some lower grade version. If you're afraid of flying, I mean, there's only so many things that you can do beneath the level of actually getting on a plane and going on a flight that might help the person become exposed to the thing that fears them or that causes them fear. So in the case of flooding, you might actually have the person go on a flight, maybe assisted by their therapist or some other person that can provide them comfort and coaching, and they'll do some relaxation techniques during part of it. But the idea of flooding is that even if they have a full-blown panic attack during that flight, panic attacks don't last forever. And once the person is over the panic symptoms, then they have to persist in the presence of this thing that had once caused them a lot of fear. And that without the panic response, the fear tends to dissipate. So you can experience an extinction of it through prolonged exposure. Like you're here, you're countering the stressor or the stimulus, and you're still alive, and eventually it seems not so bad. Another type of counter-conditioning strategy is aversion conditioning. Aversion conditioning, as the name kind of suggests, is that you're trying to get the person to exhibit an aversive or unpleasant and negative reaction to something that maybe they already previously had a positive reaction to but shouldn't. So for folks with substance use disorders like tobacco use or alcohol use, maybe while smoking or while drinking, they take some sort of drug that induces nausea or vomiting. So they come to associate that nauseous feeling with the taste of the cigarettes or the alcohol, the idea being they would then avoid this taste in the future. Aversion conditioning is also used with paraphilic conditions, where people are exhibiting inappropriate sexual arousal responses to different stimuli. So maybe you have the person either do imagination of the stimulus that they have been attracted to or looking at pictures of it while introducing other stimuli that are in complete opposition to a sexual arousal response. So things that are disgusting or really repellent. So the idea is the person then would develop a disgust or kind of repellent response to that thing that had previously elicited their attraction. So those kinds of things all deploy classical conditioning techniques. There are also a couple strategies for behavior therapy that involve operant techniques. Use of operant techniques to change behaviors in therapeutic settings, just in general, is referred to as behavior modification. So even like parents learning to reinforce appropriate behaviors in their children. Maybe they have a child with oppositional defiant disorder who has a real hard time coping with rules and authority figures. So helping the parents learn that they should reinforce the appropriate behavior and be consistent about their punishment and consequences for inappropriate behavior. That alone represents behavior modification. Token economies are a much more systematic approach to that. They're typically used in institutional settings, so schools, mental hospitals, or maybe group homes. In token economies, people they can literally get tokens like plastic chips, or they could get like punch cards or star stickers or things like that, that they can then trade in for things that they want. So maybe in a group home, a person with an intellectual disability gets a token for every day that they make their bed and complete their required household chores. When they collect enough tokens, they might be able to cash it in for watching their favorite television show or an outing with one of the supervisors of the group home. The idea being that they work up to and see the tokens as enticing. You might recognize these are conditioned or like secondary reinforcers because they represent other things that people want. But they're used to encourage behaviors in really intensive settings. And of course, behavior therapists make free use of modeling. If they've got a client who has to learn a particular behavior, maybe someone with social anxiety disorder who's not sure how to introduce themselves to a stranger and make small talk, maybe the therapist might actually demonstrate that and have the client repeat it until they feel comfortable doing it on their own. In terms of like pros and cons or strengths and limitations of this type of approach, the behavior therapies do have a really good track record with some types of conditions. This SD here stands for systematic desensitization, but systematic desensitization is wildly effective for the phobias. It's probably our single most effective therapy for a single condition that's out there. Most people who go through systematic desensitization experience some relief from their phobic symptoms, if not complete remission. Counter conditioning as a strategy is frequently the go-to method for treating our paraphilic conditions as well. So for some types of conditions, it's kind of the treatment of choice. There are some drawbacks, though, places where it doesn't work. As hopeful as people were about the use of aversive or aversion conditioning for substance use disorders, they seem not to be super effective in the long term for that, in part because people might recognize the unconditioned stimulus that's being paired with the taste of alcohol or cigarettes probably is unlikely to be presented if they go to a bar or some other place and they're smoking. Like, they're not likely to experience the unpleasant thing, and so the conditioning might not be as strong, or it might be very limited to one particular setting. Operant conditioning techniques to control and modify behaviors can be pretty effective if they're done correctly, but they do typically require a fairly intensive setting. You have to be constantly monitoring the person's behavior so that you can reward appropriate stuff and maybe discourage inappropriate stuff. Parents may be able to do this with a child because they're constantly around the child and their behavior. Teachers who see their students, like in a self-contained classroom, and see their students all day, might be able to effectively use behavior modification to change a child's problematic behavior. But for outpatient psychotherapy, like, you're not going to use a token economy if you're doing outpatient psychotherapy, because it would take your therapist or somebody else following you around on a daily basis and reinforcing certain types of behaviors, and that's just probably not feasible for most adults. And then there just is the ethical issue of whether or not behavioral strategies like operant conditioning really represent behavioral control. I mean, that's been a criticism of operant conditioning for a long time, and when it's employed in psychotherapy settings, probably the argument here is no different. This is often used in patient groups like children or severely disabled people or mental hospital patients who may otherwise have limitations in their ability to make choices about how they're being treated. And if they're being exposed to these types of conditioning principles, how much of that really is honoring of their free will? Is this behavior modification or control? It's worth considering. I think the argument for use of it is that people feel that folks' behaviors are improved in ways that help them live more full and happy lives. And there's definitely evidence of that too. But yeah, some folks feel a little uncomfortable with the idea of controlling others' behaviors because it seems a lot like it. So I hope this has been a helpful tour for you of our behavioral therapies, and maybe gives you a glimpse of some of these strategies. If you have questions, of course, feel free to follow up with me or check back to your textbook.